So welcome to the workshop about Symfony Forms. For a start, who is a Symfony user in here? Awesome, everybody. Who has used the form component before? Also almost everybody. That's perfect because we won't do a lot about the basics, but I will try to show you how to use the form component in a DDD application this time. I heard there were a couple of DDD workshops in the previous days, right? How many of you did do the OOP or the lightning fast test workshop, for example? Okay, quite a few. So I think the workshop is perfectly in line with those workshops. I didn't plan to explain a lot about DDD anyway, but we can look at a few things in the beginning if anybody's unsure. So in general, the workshop should already be running on your machine. You just need to make sure that you update the repository to the current version because I changed a few things. With the git pull, also make sure to update the database schema, and then it should already work on the forms SC WebSC website. All right. Is there anybody that kind of considers themselves a beginner with forms or DDD? Okay. For those of you that I recommend that you get together with somebody that doesn't consider themselves such as a beginner and get together as a pair and work together. We have quite a lot of assignments because I want you to learn a lot in these 3 hours. And I think your experience will be much better if you get together with someone else that has some experience and that can help you with the tricky stuff, the little details that you might struggle with. Okay? So we'll do some kind of seeding game. Can all of you that want to have another partner that is more experienced raise your hands? Like if you think you're a bit beginner. And can anybody else let's do this. So everybody that thinks he or she is a beginner, please raise your hands. Okay, and I think you two in the back as well, right? Maybe you can get together with someone else that's a bit more experienced, each of you, if you want, but that's optional. Okay. If you check out the website, that should look something like this. All right. Is that not working for anybody in here? Did you update your database schema? Did you clear the cache? So just to make sure, let's try this as well. So if you clear the cache, that should work. If you clear it this way, if you do just the bin console cache clear, that might not work because of the doctrine proxies. But that should work in general. Smith? All right. So, and I will start with explaining a bit about the application that we're working with today. Is anybody still struggling? So the application works for everybody. All right. So about the example, the application that we're working with today is CRM. It's like a customer relationship management system. And basically, there's two types of concepts that we can manage with this system. Contacts, which is any kind of person and the contact information that we have, and the organizations that these contacts belong to. All right? So it's a very simplistic example. I think everybody of you has worked with something like that before. And right, we're going to work with that and see how we can develop forms in a DDD environment. All right? The architecture of the application is split in 3 different layers. You can check that out in the source directory. We have the domain layer, which is our domain, our DDD model, right? And in that, we have different aggregates. We have the contact aggregate and the organization aggregate. So those are the two concepts that we work with. The organization is a very simple aggregate. It's basically just a CRUD object. And we will use very simple CRUD forms to manage that organization aggregate in the first assignments. Later on, we will work with the contact aggregate, which is a bit more specific because it has an inherent workflow. You can check the application layer, which has a couple of commands. And all those commands do something with a contact. And if you look at the commands, they already tell you a bit about the vocabulary about commands and about the workflow of handling commands. So at first, when a contact enters the system, it is proposed. Somebody proposes a contact to be included in the system. And then there's kind of a review process where somebody else checks the contact, checks whether it's valid or exists already, something like that. And they can either approve it or reject it. If it's rejected, it's basically deleted from the system. And if it's approved, it is considered a valid contact that can be dealt with. Once the contact is approved, the contact can be modified and merged with other contacts. All right? So it's a very simple workflow, but it's also a very interesting one when you use it in combination with forms. The assignments are in the assignments directory. There's an introduction. It's all markdown files. The introduction explains a bit about the domain and about domain-driven design in general. So if you're unsure about that, you can read the introduction. And then you can start with the first task for CRUD forms. So the goal of the first task, or in general, the mode of this workshop today will be, I have created different assignments for you. Each of them have a small goal with a couple of steps that have to be done to reach that goal. And there's also a number of hints to help you reach that goal at the bottom. So you see here, the goal for the first assignment is to add a CRUD for organizations. So you want to be able to create and modify organizations in the UI. Okay? I'll show you where we are in the UI with that. We have the organizations page here and a create organization button that doesn't work yet, because that's something that you're going to develop. Both creating and modifying organizations are part of the first assignments, and it should be very easy for you if you have worked with Symfony Forms before, because it's a standard CRUD Symfony Form, nothing very special really. Okay? There's a number of tasks that you can check and a few hints that should help you if you struggle. Okay? And you can also check out the solution if you're completely stuck or something doesn't work, or if you just want to compare your work with the master solution, you can compare it with the tag 01-CRUD. Okay? In general, the mode of this workshop is very, I'd say, you can work on your own. I will do breaks in between if I realize that a few people have the same question or have doubts about the few concepts. So I will explain the concept of data transformers and data mappers in between when we get there. But in general, you can work on your own. I recommend to work with your partner at your table, because usually that's a much better experience than to just work alone. But it's optional. It's up to you. And that's it. Check the assignments. I'm around. And I will help you and answer any questions for everybody if there's doubts. Okay? the app dev controller doesn't work with the VirtualBox. So I recommend you to get some debug messages to copy the contents of the app dev controller to the app PHP controller, front controller, and clear the cache, because then you will get error messages and exception traces and all the stuff instead of just error 500. It's a bit tricky that the organization requires an argument in the constructor. Here's some hints how you can solve that problem. Since I think some people don't know about it yet, I saw a few people that basically create a new class like this. New PHP file. Okay, my class. Now I need to add the namespace, blah, 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 blah. All of that is not really necessary. PHP Storm can generate most of that stuff for you. And what you need to do is you need to map the source directory to your base namespace. So basically you see that the directories that you have in your project correspond to the namespace of the class, right? So infrastructure web controller, that's infrastructure web controller. And the only missing thing here in the directory path is this base namespace. And what you can do is you can map this base namespace to the source directory with PHP Storm in the settings. I'll show you how. So if you go to File, Settings, then you find these point directories. And in directories, you find the source directory, which you can mark with a right click as sources. So basically, you tell PHP Storm, all my source files are in this directory. Okay? And then there's a little feature that is not very visible, which is the source folder appears here on the right-hand side. And you see this very, very tiny little p, right? I think it's, yeah, properties. If you open that, you can enter a prefix for the namespace. Right? So, settings, directories, mark a source folder, and then click on the little p to enter that contact prefix. If we OK, remove our class again, and now we won't use new PHP file, but PHP class. My class. Then you see that the namespace is there. So PHP Storm already knows the namespace because you told it the base namespace, and then the rest is just deduced from the directory structure. Okay, so I recommend you to do that for any projects that you work on because it saves a lot of time. And then take a few more minutes to talk about the second assignment to explain some basic stuff for everybody. Yes, no? Is that interesting for you? Okay, some are like this, some are like please. All right, so I will just take a few minutes so that you continue working after that. So what I'm going to do is I will check out the solution of the first assignment. And then we can just discuss this for a very short time. And I ask you to please, if you have any questions, just ask me, because maybe other people have the same question and they would like to hear the answer of that question. So basically, what we implemented in the first assignment was our organization type. That's what you should have. here you can see the workflow in the controller. Basically, when you create a form, the first step is to call the create method. Maybe it's interesting what is happening internally for that create method. So when you call create form, then the first thing that the form component actually does internally is it creates a form builder instance. Right? The form builder instance is what you get in the build form method. And the form builder instance can be used to configure the form, to add fields, to configure data mappers. All that stuff can be done on the builder instance, right? Once you're done with the configuration of the builder instance, that builder, form builder, is transformed into a form instance. And the form instance is what is returned to the controller. So create form does these two things. It creates a builder, passes the builder to the build form method, and after build form is over, it will create the form instance, which has a slightly different responsibility than the builder. The form builder is basically just a very stupid object that contains information and configuration. Okay? It doesn't have any logic, not very much. When you turn that builder into a form instance, that form instance has a lot of logic inside, and it cannot be modified. It's mostly immutable. All right? So all the configuration is fixed at the point where you call create form. The form instance, compared to the builder, is responsible for two things, mainly. It's responsible for displaying data that you already have in the database in the form fields. So basically for converting existing organizations to, or injecting existing organizations into your form fields. And after you click submit, for moving that data from the form fields that you submitted back into the organization. That's basically what the form instance is about. Of course, that's not very simple, but all that logic is inside that form instance. And that logic happens when you call create form, where you can pass an existing organization, like here in the edit action. So here in create form, since you pass an organization, data of that organization will be read and written into the form fields, so that when you show the form, you actually see the values of that organization in the form. In the next step, you call handle request. And handle request will move the data from the submitted request into the form instance and move that data back onto the organization object. Okay? You see that we don't check for the request method here, because that's already happening inside handle request. So handle request will only do something if it's a post request, not if it's get request. Okay? If it's a get request, that's basically just a no-op call. Just doesn't do anything. Now your question might be, okay, what if I have a form that should be submitted with get, or that should be submitted with put? For these cases, you can pass a third argument to the create form call, which is options. And in these options, there's one option that is called method. And you could set that to get or to put. And if you do that, then handle request will actually listen for put requests or for get requests. Right? Multiple, yeah, I think you can do. No, you can't. Since this is not only used to handle the request, but also when you render the form, this will be the method of the form tag in your in the template. So you know the form tag has a method parameter, and there it can only be one. That's why. All right, and then usually always when we have a form, we have this if statement where we check if the form is submitted and the form is valid. Actually, you can also do just this. It's the same, logically. But I recommend you to keep the is submitted in there as well, since it just makes more sense. You want to check if it's submitted, and if it's submitted, then you want to check if it's valid. It's easier to understand in general. And then we do something with the data, with the updated data. So if we created a new organization, then we will add it to our organization repository. If you check the source code, you see that organization repository is an interface where we define methods that we need. We don't really care what implementation is behind that, if that is stored in a database or with Doctrine ORM or with something else or on the file system or wherever. You don't really care about it. That's an implementation detail. And you see here we have one implementation for the ORM. But one thing that you frequently need is an in-memory implementation that just keeps everything in memory for tests. For example, if you do functional tests, then it's sufficient to have in-memory implementations, and that will speed up the execution of your tests tremendously. So if we create a new organization, that organization is added to the repository. And if we added an existing organization, then that organization is already in the repository. So we only need to flush the repository to synchronize all the changes of those organizations to the repository. About the organization type itself, I think the most interesting thing is this empty data option that you used. It's used to create new objects with a non-standard constructor. So by default, the form component will do this. And that doesn't work if you have any mandatory constructor arguments. So what we did here is we just generated a new organization ID. But something else that is frequently needed is injecting data from the form. So assume, for example, that the organization has a mandatory argument name in the constructor. And you want to get that name from the form and inject it. Then that's actually possible, because this argument here that we get is a form interface, a form instance. And from this form instance, that's the form instance that we have in the controller, right? The same one. We can get the name field and the data of that name field and inject it into the organization instance. So that's what you want to do if you want to have any of the data in the fields in the constructor of your object. Are there any questions about the first task? If you remember another question later on, just tell me, raise your hand. Let me briefly introduce the second assignment for those that haven't started or for those that are just about getting started. In our domain model, we have more than just a name in the organization. We can check it here. Actually, we have an ID, which already generated that. We have a name. It's possible to edit that name already. And we have 3 more values. We have an email address, we have a phone number, and an address. And those are modeled as value objects, proper classes. So if we check the phone number, that's just a class around the string. Now, you might ask, why is it necessary to create a new class for just a basic string? That doesn't make sense all the time, but it sometimes makes sense if there's a semantic meaning to that string. So for example, an email address always has a specific format, right? So at some point, an email address enters your system where you will validate if that's a valid email address. And then kind of you know that it's an email address, right? And you might have services like a mailer that expect a recipient address for something. And there you can actually use the type-int email to tell that you want an email address. And you can be sure that this is a valid email that you get, right? Or for IDs, it's the same thing. You see that the IDs of our different aggregates are modeled as classes as well. And that makes sense, for example, for storing references to other objects. For example, a contact belongs to an organization. So we can store the organization ID of that organization. And it's not just a string, right? It's an organization ID. That's an important concept in our domain. That's why we model that as a separate class. However, I don't recommend to create value objects for everything, like for name. Just choose wisely if you need, if like a specific concept has a meaning in your domain, and then create a value object. Otherwise, just use strings and integers and all that basic stuff. So here for the first name, for example, in my opinion, it doesn't make sense to, at least not in this application, to create a name instance. There's no business value in that. All right. So for these objects, the phone number class and the email class, we need to have custom types that convert the data that we enter in the form to an email instance, or that convert the data that we enter in the form to a phone number instance. And the technique that is used for that in Symfony is called DataTransforms. I think some of you may have heard about that. Basically, a data transformer is a very simple interface with a transform method and the reverse transform method. And one method, basically, they're just mathematically, it's a bijective function. So you take a value of one type, you convert it to a value of another type, and the other method is just the opposite, right? So we can convert an email address to a string and a string to an email address. And if you chain the two methods, then you should get the original value. Okay? So the task here is to create a data transformer or a type for the phone number instance that converts the phone number to a text, and that text will be handled by Symfony's own text type. And it's the same for the email address. Okay. Who of you has already started with the second task? Okay. Many of you, not all. I'd say you can just continue. You can also continue with the third task if you're done, because I think many people, or some people, are still struggling with the first. And I will talk a bit about the second task later on, about the solution. Okay? This one is very hard, and this one is super easy. Okay, yeah. It's not quite easy, but I think once you get the gist, I hope it makes sense. So basically, about these value objects. Let's check out the sample solution. The generic idea is quite simple, right? You have this transform and reverse transform methods in the phone number type, for example, that convert a value from your domain model to a value from your view, the HTML, the input that you have in your HTML code, right? So you want to convert the phone number to the string and convert the string back to a phone number instance. And that's what we do in these transform methods. By default, not by default, but in general, the form component knows 3 different formats in a form. There's the model format, which is the format that you use in your domain model. In this case, that's a phone number instance. There's the view format that is used in the HTML. That is most of the time a string, right? And then there's also a normalized format in between. I won't talk too much about that. You don't really need to care about it. Just so that you have heard about these terms, you have the model format, you have the normalized format, and you have the view format. And when Symfony converts your data, it first converts from the model format to the normalized format, and then from the normalized format to the view format. And then back. When you submit the form, it converts the string back to the normalized format, and the normalized format back to the model format. Okay? For these 2 steps, model to normalized and normalized to model, and normalized to view and back, we have 2 different sets of transformers. That's why we have add view transformer, which is normalized to view, and add model transformer, which is model to normalized, just in case you wonder about that. Okay? The model transformer makes sure that our model format, the phone number, is converted to a string. We do that here. It's important to cover empty values here. So we need to check if the value is null and not a phone number instance. Then we need to return null as well. Otherwise, we will get an error here when we call toString. And it's the same on the way back. If the field is empty, then we don't want to create a new phone number instance, but we want to return null. If you have your own data transformers, it's always also quite important to check if data types match what you expect. And what you should do if they don't is throw a transformation failed exception. That's a special exception that is caught by the form framework to display an error in the user interface. So for example, if you have a date field and you enter a string that is not a date, not a valid date, then Symfony will use its date transformer to convert that string to a date, and that will fail since it's not a valid date. So it will throw a transformation failed exception. And this transformation failed exception is caught and displayed as an error message in the form. You can customize the error message of these transformation failed exceptions through an option. So here, for example, for the phone number, if you want to customize the error message, that's the invalid message option. And you could say, this is not a valid phone number. And this message is shown whenever this transformation failed exception is thrown. OK? Any questions about this? It depends. If the value object contains one single value, I would use a data transformer since it's much easier. If the value object contains multiple values, like in the next example with the addresses, I would use a data mapper since it's much more complicated with data transformer. OK, the second example, or the second part of the task, which was optional, was to implement the email type. That one had a few pitfalls, since the email type class name collides with the email type class name from Symfony. So you need to make sure that you inherit the email type from Symfony, which is basically an HTML5 text input with type email. And here we also set the email constraint, so that this type is always validated against the email constraint from the Symfony validator component. And then the transformation is exactly the same as before. There's one difference, which is this getBlockPrefix method. We didn't have that in the phone number type. If we remove that getBlockPrefix method and display our form, we will have an exception. Oh, man. Seriously. There you go. So unable to render the form because block names array contains duplicates. If you look at this exception method, then you see there's a number of names: form, text, email, email, and organization email. These names are used when you use the theming system in Symfony, because you can change the way that each individual field type is rendered by adding a block to the form theme with the name of that type. So if you add the block form row to your form theme, I won't talk about that too much, but just for those of you that know form theming, you can customize how a row in a form is displayed for all field types, since form is the base field type of all field types. All right? All field types inherit from that type. And in our concrete example, we have our custom email type, which inherits Symfony's email type, and Symfony's email type inherits the text type, and the text type inherits the form type. So that's the inheritance chain that we have here. Form, text, email from Symfony, and email from our code. And that's another block name that contains the ID of the field, organization email, in order to be able to style just that one field. All right? And you see that there's a duplicate name, and for some reasons, Symfony has a problem with that, if two names in this chain are the same. That's why we need to change the name for our custom type. That's exactly what we did by overriding the get block prefix method. We override or we change the prefix, which is usually generated out of the short class name, so just the part without the type. And if we have a get block prefix method, then that is used instead. That's why it works now. All right. Are there any questions about this task still? All right, then I will do a short introduction for the third task with the addresses. Assignment 3 is very similar to assignment 2 in some ways, but very different in others. So basically, again, we want to create a form type for value objects, but the difference is that the address object has multiple values inside. So we need a form with multiple fields to enter addresses. And that doesn't really work with DataTransforms. It doesn't work so well. So we will use a data mapper instead. And if you haven't looked at it yet, I recommend you to check out the blog post that I linked in the Markdown file. Maybe we can check it here. There you go. And at the bottom, you see an example of the map data to forms and map forms to data methods of this interface. So, like with the data transformer that takes our model data and converts it to view data and back, that's the same thing for the data mapper. It just works a bit different. Because it doesn't just receive the value, but it also receives all the forms, all the fields in our form. So if we have a form, our address type, for example, with the fields street, postal code, city, and country code, then we will receive an array with forms that contains all the forms, all those fields. Street, postal code, city, and country code. And then we can access each of these fields and call setData to set the default value from our address instance. So for example, forms street, setData, and then address get street. Forms postal code, setData, address get postal code. So basically, we can customize which getters are called when our form is populated from an address instance. And on the way back, map forms to data, that is called when a form is submitted with the submitted forms. And here we can customize how our value object is constructed. So that's basically more or less the same thing that we did in empty data. Not quite, but it's very similar. We create a new instance, and we take the values of all the fields that we need and write it into the instance. And basically, that's what we need to do in the third assignment. All right. Let's say continue, and if you have questions, just let me know. Is there any question up front about this assignment in general? The task about the addresses, and so that I can explain a bit about the last task that we will make today, since I think we're done at 12:45, which is in 20 minutes. Let's see. All right, so I think the task was, in general, quite straightforward. How was the task for you? I don't know. Maybe it was not. Oh, okay. All right. So I hope at least that the concept is clear. It's very similar to DataTransforms, but the details are, of course, a bit different. I can show you the solution that I have here. It's even a bit simpler than in my blog. I should update that. So let's look at a sample solution of the address type, because some stuff isn't even needed. So that's probably the same thing that you have, right? You added all the fields to the address type for street, postal code, city, and country code. Basically, most of them can be a text type, since if we check our fields, that's all strings. And for the country code, what I used was the country field, the country type of Symfony, which gives the dropdown with all the countries and returns the country code. And then instead of set data mapper or add model transformer, we use set data mapper and use the data mapper, or the current type as data mapper. If we check the two functions or methods for mapping our existing addresses to our forms, then let's look at this. What we get in here is a collection of all the fields. That's actually an iterator, which is why we need to call iterator to array first in order to be able to do accesses by index. So if we don't do this here, then the call by index will fail, the access by index. All right, since we have an iterator and that's not array accessible. Then the first thing we need to check is if the data is actually an address. If we don't get an address instance, for example, if the address is null, then we just return, which means the form remains empty. If the data is a valid address instance, then we can get the data from this address instance and write it into the fields of the form. So now we have our form that shows all the values of the address, and then we can change these values, submit the form back to the server. And when we get all these values, we need to create a new address instance with the new values. And that's, in general, I think not very spectacular. We create a new address instance and inject the data of all the fields. The only thing that we need to check is that if all the fields are empty, then we should set the data to null. And there's different ways of doing that. You can either just call is empty on every field, or what I used, I used array reduce together with an anonymous function where you can reduce basically the is empty calls to 1. And if every form is empty, then data is null and the address form remains empty. Are there any questions about this task? Okay, let's try. Technically, if this works, then the debugger, there's no debugging in here. Yeah, okay. Well, there's always die. So at least. I think the CSRF token is not really a child of the form, but it's kind of added later on. It's a bit, you don't want to look into that code. For exactly that reason, it should be invisible to you, basically. All right. Are there any questions about this? Other questions? Okay, about the next assignment, I would like to do a short, give you a short overview of the architecture. The next assignment is about proposing contacts, writing a form for proposing contacts. In these examples that we used right now, we basically used Symfony's CRUD system. So we always mapped forms to objects and then just flushed them to the database. But in DDD applications, you frequently will use commands to make changes to your domain model. So the command, approve contact or propose contact, is basically a command to your domain layer to do something. And the command will be handled in the command handler, which will load objects from the database or from the repositories, do something with them, for example, call methods, and then write changes back to the repositories. And the nice thing about the command handler is that it can take any other services as well. So you can take other repositories and get data from other repositories and inject that data also into your aggregates when you call methods like approve. In the case of propose contact, the propose contact command, it's very simple. We just call the propose contact, the propose method on the contact, and then add it to the repository. So it's a very simple application here. In real life, that's oftentimes a few lines more than that, but not much more. Now what we need to do is we need to write a form that maps to a proposed contact command. So we want to get a proposed contact command in our controller. Where's the it's the proposal controller. So in the proposal action, we want to have a form of some proposed contact type. You want to handle the request. And if the form is submitted and valid, then it should return the proposed contact command with the data that we want to send. And we can just get the command bus and handle the command returned by the form. And then we can redirect to the contact list. All right? That's basically what you need in the controller. And you see that our controller stays very small. And most of the logic is delegated to the application. Now the question is, how do we get the form to return a proposed contact command? What's your suggestions? Maybe some information. The proposed contact command is basically a value object as well. All the information is injected in the constructor. It has multiple fields, and it can't be changed afterwards. So what would we use? Probably a data mapper. And I think it's also possible to use empty data, the empty data option here that we used before. All right, you can try that. Are there any questions about this assignment in general? Unfortunately, the workshop is a bit short. It's just 3 hours. You have a couple of more assignments if you're interested in the rest. There's a few more stuff. It's all described in the Markdown file, so you can check it out at home. If you have any questions, just write me an email, and I will try to answer. Yeah, and I hope you enjoyed the workshop. I know it was a very heterogeneous group. There were some people that were like really bloody starters, and some that were more advanced. And I hope that everybody got something from the workshop. Thanks a lot.